This video is going to break down why the new big three that the Nets just formed is destined to implode. Yesterday, the Brooklyn Nets and Rockets engaged in a major blockbuster trade that saw them completely give up the farm for James Harden. They traded some really good players and guys like Jared Allen and Karis LeVert and 4 first-round picks for Harden. While the Nets are really good on paper, I think they're a horrible fit on the court, which will lead to this move blowing up in Brooklyn's face. The first issue here is lack of chemistry. In order for a team to win a championship, there needs to be good team chemistry. We've seen many ultra-talented teams in the past fail, such as the 2004 Lakers or even last year's LA Clippers, because the star players kept butting heads. Well, this big three is going to have poor chemistry from the jump. It was reported back in November, when the Harden to the Nets trade talk started, that Kyrie didn't even want the Nets to acquire James Harden in the first place. It was reported that Durant wanted Harden, but Kyrie didn't. Furthermore, Kyrie has already alienated himself from the players of the team. He recently decided to just dip without letting the coaching staff know where the hell he is. He claims it's personal reasons, but he's been caught on video partying with his sister. It was also reported recently that he's grown distant from KD, and he was furious with the Nets' decision to hire Steve Nash. Already, this big three Nets team has poor chemistry, as Kyrie has issues with Harden and KD. So it's going to hurt the team on the court if this big three doesn't even want to play with each other. And that brings me to my next point. James Harden, KD, and Kyrie won't fit together because they're all extremely ball dominant. If you look at any successful big three in league history, it worked because one member of the big three was willing to radically sacrifice his game for team success. Chris Bosh on the Miami Heat went from a 24 points per game scorer to a 16 points per game scorer who primarily knocked down threes and played defense. On the big three Celtics, Ray Allen went from a 26 points per game scoring machine to a spot-up shooter to help them win a ring. Who's sacrificing their game like that on this Nets team? More than likely, neither of them will, which is going to lead to chemistry problems. All three of these guys are extremely high usage players. James Harden for years has played in a system that was extremely ISO heavy. The entire offensive system revolved around Harden's incredible ability to get to the basket, draw fouls at a high rate, and hit that step back three. In Houston, he rarely played off the ball, and his unwillingness to be involved in the offense unless it revolved around him was the main reason he had a falling out with Chris Paul. Kyrie Irving is another high usage guy who likes to take a lot of shots. Kyrie has proven to be a very selfish player who doesn't really like sharing the spotlight. The main reason he left the Cavs in the first place was because he wanted to be the man of his own team. He didn't like that when the Cavs won the championship back in 2016, that LeBron took most of the credit. Kyrie didn't even want Harden in the first place, so he hardly comes off as a player that's willing to take a much lesser role for the betterment of the team. And Kevin Durant also doesn't seem like someone who's going to radically sacrifice his game and just become a spot-up shooter. Kevin Durant is someone who partly left Golden State in the first place because he didn't like being second fiddle to Steph Curry. Draymond Green himself said that everything changed for Durant when he won titles, but LeBron was still viewed as the league's best player. KD himself has also said that he hates being viewed as number 2. He came to Brooklyn to win as the top dog on a championship team and take most of the credit, so he's not radically sacrificing his game. So since we know that Durant, Harden, and Kyrie are super ball dominant players that are more than likely unwilling to evolve their games for the betterment of the team, why would anyone think they're going to gel together on the court? Yes, the Nets are probably the best team in the league on paper, but in reality, championships aren't won on paper, they're won on the court. If superstars don't play well together, they tend not to work. I think it's fair to assume that the Nets are going to be extremely ISO heavy this season. KD, Kyrie, and Harden are all going to have a ton of ISO plays. All three are great offensive players, so the Nets are going to score a ton of points. But this issue is going to rear its ugly head in the playoffs. The reality is that when you're an ISO heavy team It makes you a lot easier for the defense to guard. Constant player and ball movement makes the team offense more difficult to defend. When you're a team that's ISO heavy and don't generate a lot of easy looks and rely on tough shot making, it can cause the offense to fall apart when the tough shots stop falling. The Clippers experienced this the hard way in last year's playoffs. The Clippers were extremely talented, but they were a team that relied on great shot creation rather than ball movement. This led to them blowing a 3-1 lead to the Denver Nuggets because once the difficult shots stopped falling, they just flat out couldn't score. I predict the Nets will be a top 5 offensive team this year, but with this big 3, the offense will fall apart the deeper they get into the playoffs. And that brings me to my next major problem, which is defense. The Nets were already having defensive issues before this trade, but now those problems are going to intensify because in the trade, the Nets gave up their best defender in Jarrett Allen. Jarrett Allen is an absolute game changer on the defensive end. He's 6'11" with a monstrous 7'6" wingspan, which makes it extremely difficult for driving players to score at him in the paint. Now with him gone, the Nets don't have any good rim protectors. The Nets still have DeAndre Jordan, but DJ is washed at this point of his career. He was once a great defensive center, but his effort on that end of the court took a nosedive years ago. Furthermore, this big 3 of the Nets isn't very good defensively. Now KD has become a good defender, but James Harden has never been known for his defense, and neither has Kyrie. And the Nets roster lacks elite perimeter defenders. While the Nets look like they're going to score 120 points per game, they also look like they're going to give up 120 points per game. Being a great offensive team and a poor defensive team is a recipe for failure. Generally, you have to be both a top 10 offense and top 10 defense in order to be a legit title contender. In the playoffs, shots aren't always going to hit, so you need to be able to save points by slowing down the other team. Teams that have a hard time generating stops usually flame out in the first or second round. And the final reason why the Nets are set to implode is due to the lack of bench depth. By trading away both Caris LeVert and Taurean Prince, the Nets just completely depleted a really good second unit. LeVert has been inconsistent this year, but he's a threat to go off for 30 on any given night. Having a guy like that come off your bench is huge. Taurean Prince was failing to live up to expectations in Brooklyn, but he was a very serviceable player. Now the Nets have a pretty poor second unit with those guys gone. I always felt that bench depth in the NBA was overrated, particularly in the playoffs, but this is going to hurt the Brooklyn Nets. The reason I say bench depth is overrated is because in the playoffs, rotations shorten and your starters play very heavy minutes. So your 10-man rotation usually becomes an 8-man rotation. But having a deep roster is important for keeping your starters healthy. Because the Nets don't have a deep bench anymore, KD, Kyrie, and Harden will have to play over 35 minutes a night to win games, which increases the likeliness that one of them will get hurt. Kyrie is already super injury prone, and Kevin Durant is coming off a torn Achilles. If one of these guys gets hurt, the Nets' title chances are officially over, and with very little depth, the chances that this happens is now more likely. So there you have it, sports fans. While the Nets are super talented, this is still a very flawed roster, and I believe that these flaws will cause the Nets to implode, and unfortunately for the Nets, they pretty much have what they have. Going into next season, the team's salary is $177 million, so there won't be any cap space to make some needed additions, such as adding a defender. Furthermore, since the Nets gave up 4 first-round picks, they're without trade assets, which would be required to trade for some complementary talent. The Nets are locked into this roster for the next year and a half, a roster that is still very flawed and needs reinforcements. I believe the James Harden trade is a move that will prove to be ultimately not worth it. Ironically, Sean Marks dug the Nets out of a massive hole when the Nets gave up 3 future picks for washed KG and Pierce. Now it appears he's repeating the same mistake. Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, and James Harden are all free agents in 2022, meaning they can all leave the team and leave the Nets with nothing which would be devastating for a Nets team with no young players or future picks. This will put the Nets right back where they were right after the KG and Pierce trade from 7 years ago. The James Harden trade was an understandable gamble, but a gamble that I think is not going to end up working. Anyway, guys, that's going to be the end of the video. Will the Nets Big 3 experiment work? Tell me in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel, and enjoy the rest of your day.